Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Scripter Joe over here. Welcome back to episode 2 of this tutorial series, making you a new Roblox scripter fledgling. Without further ado, let's talk about the content of this video. We're gonna talk about functions, continue talking about them, comments, and if statements. So let's continue from where we left off. We talked about the print function and how it accepts input and processes that input by displaying it in the output interface. And something to note is that every function accepts input. For example, in the print function right now, we are putting in some input, 12, 3, those are 2 inputs, and it gives back output. You need to know that every function gives back output. In this case, for the print function, it returns an output, but that output is basically nothing. What do I mean? It returns nil. So if we create a variable and name it output, all right, and then we set that variable to print, what will happen is the print function will run and it will display something in the output, but the output variable will be equal to nil. So if we print the output variable, we will notice when we run the game that nil will be displayed in place of output. So let's run the game, let's see what happens. As you can see, nil is displayed corresponding to the output variable. This shows us that the print function returns nil as output. Now let's create our own function. As we said, each function has its own input and output. I will show you how to create input for your set function and how to have it return back a certain output you want it to return back as output. So if you want to create a function, you start with the statement local, same as a variable, and then you write or type in right after it function. This tells the computer that you want to create a function and not a variable, and then you name that function. In this case, we want to create a function called add. To close this function, before closing the function, you need to add parentheses in order to set what input you want the function to have. In between the parentheses, you input type in the input names. To close the function, we just press enter after the parentheses, or we add the statement end afterwards on a later line, and this closes the function, right? To set the input of our newly created function add, we type in the name of the input, right? Where we're gonna have number 1. We're gonna have 2 inputs, number 1 and number 2. They are separated by a comma. That's how you separate inputs. If you want to create multiple inputs, you just separate them with a comma. So now we have 2 inputs for our function add, number 1 and number 2. It's a good practice to set or tell the computer what the data type of these inputs will be. So when you call this function later on, as you call print, call it later on a later line like this, and you want to input some inputs, it's a good practice to tell the computer beforehand what the type of the inputs will be. So number 1, to tell the computer the data types of these inputs, you add a colon after the variable or the input name, and then you type in the data type of this input. In this case, it's going to be number. For number 1, number, and for number 2, it's also going to be a number. This tells the computer that those 2 input variables are of the number data type. It tells it what to expect. And as you can see, when you want to type in the input later on, you will notice that it hints to you that it should be a number. This helps you with the calling functions and showing you what inputs they have, what their types are, so you don't input the wrong data type, right? So if you want, so now we have the inputs ready, and now we want our function, newly created function, to give us an output. How do we set that output? How do we tell the computer what to return to us when we call this function as output? So we use a statement called return. And then whatever is after this statement is what the function returns. So if we have nothing after the statement, basically the function becomes a void function. It returns nothing. It returns basically nil. So if we create a variable and we call it sum, and we set it to the called add function, when we print sum, we will notice that in the output interface, nil will be printed out over here, number 9, line number 9, yes. So what if we want the function to return something tangible, a number, right? Since we're adding this function, supposedly we want it to add the two numbers we input into it. What do we do? How do we return the sum of those two numbers? Basically, you type in after the return statement what you want to return, which is number 1 plus number 2. Now let's talk about math science for a second. They only apply to numbers, right? So we have the plus sign for addition, the subtraction sign, which is minus, for subtraction, the asterisk for multiplication, and the slash for division. This basically means number 1 divided by number 2. What will be returned is the division answer, right? Number 1 divided by number 2, number 1 times number 2, number 1 minus number 2, and like this, number 1 plus number 2, which is what we want, the sum. So now if we call the function, right? We're calling it over here. It will return the two inputs you input into it after each other. So if we input 1 and 2 into the function, it will return to us 1 plus 2, which is 3. And that will print it out in the output interface right now, which is 3 right over here. Now let's say we have nothing in the input. What will happen? Let's see what happens. An error will occur. Why? This is because nothing stands for nil. And over here it's telling you to add whatever is in the input with whatever is in the input the second time. Now you didn't put anything in the first or second input slots, right? Nothing in between. You didn't put a comma, you didn't put a number over here and here, right? You didn't put anything. So basically it substitutes, what the function does, it substitutes the emptiness to nil. So nothing means nil. So you're basically adding nil plus nil. And you can't add nil plus nil, right? They are not numbers. The same thing happens if you put a number with a nil input, right? Nil cannot be added to a number. 1 cannot be added to nil. They have to be, both of the inputs have to be numbers. That is the only case where you won't have an error. So if we run this, we will still have an error. It will tell you, attempt to perform arithmetic addition on number and nil. It can't perform addition on number and nil. They have to be both numbers, right? Now you created your first function, which is add. Be proud of yourself. Now if you want, let's talk about comments for a second. If you want to add text, right, that explains the function for readers or those interested, or for yourself in the future if you come back to the script and you want to remember what it was about, you can add text that tells you about it. How do you do that? You use comments. How do you create comments? you use specific symbols. So if you want to write a comment, you just use the double minus sign, and then you write whatever you want. This function adds the two number inputs. This gives the reader some context, the person looking at your code some context, right? So what comment is basically is just text that the computer ignores and doesn't process or take it as orders, right? It's something for your own reference. If you want to create comments, use the double minus sign and it will comment out everything in the line after the two minuses. Whatever is before the minuses is not commented out. If you want to comment out a section, not everything after the double minus sign, you use double minus sign and double brackets. This basically comments out everything in between the double brackets. So we want to close the double brackets over here. Now this sentence is commented out, not the whole line, which the double minus sign does. So this is comments for you. Pretty useful if you're getting a lot of clutter in your code, right? You want to make out what your code means. So let's talk about if statements for now. This is where booleans are important. I would like you to recall the sleeping baby example from the previous video. Imagine you have a baby in your game and you have a variable called sound. And when the baby is sleeping, or if the baby is sleeping, you want sound to be set to the string zzz, which is the text representation of the sleeping noise you make when you're sleeping. But when the baby is awake, you want the sound variable to be set to blue blah blah, okay? So how do you do this in code, right? Use the if statement. How do you create an if statement? You start it with the word if. This basically tells you if, and then you put a boolean after that. If, for example, true in this case. If true, if the boolean is true, so we only have two booleans, true and false. If the boolean is not false, it's actually true, then do blah blah blah. So you started with the if word. Yeah, that sounded wrong. You started with the if statement, then you put a boolean after it. In this case, we have true, and then you have, then you add then, and then you close off that if statement with an end. If you press enter after then, it will the IDE will automatically add the end statement. Now this is telling the computer if the boolean is true, which is true in this case, then do the following in between then and end. We want it to set the sound to zzz. Let's take it in this case that the sound that true means the baby is sleeping. So the sound will be set to zzz. However, when it's false, meaning the baby is awake, then this won't be read. So when the boolean is false after the if statement, whatever is in between then and end, the computer won't process. Basically, this task is not done. Sound is not set to zzz. However, when the boolean is true, sound is set to zzz. So let's print sound and see what happens. All right. So if we look at, it's on line 19, right? Right, we forgot to replace the null with a number. That's why it errored. And line 10, let's replace it with a 2. Now we have line 11 printed 11. And for the sound variable, we have zzz printed out. Why is that? That is because the boolean is set to true. What if it was set to false? Let's see what happens. Then the sound won't be set to zzz. What will happen is it will state what it was set prior to that, which is nothing. no, right? It wasn't set to anything. So what will be printed out is no, as you can see over here. So what if you want to tell the computer if the baby is sleeping, which in that case the boolean will be true, then do this, set the sound to ZZZ. But when it is not sleeping, so otherwise, so if the baby is sleeping, set sound to ZZZ. Otherwise, set sound to blue blah blah. How do we do that in an if statement? We use a statement called else. A word called else, which basically means otherwise. So if baby is sleeping, true, then set sound to ZZZ. Otherwise, whatever is after else and before end will be performed if the boolean was false, right? If the baby was not sleeping. If the baby was awake. So else, set sound to blue blah blah, right? So if the boolean is false, baby is awake, the sound will be set to blue blah blah. Let's see what is printed out. As you can see, blue blah blah. That was because the boolean was set to false, meaning the baby was awake. When it's set to true, you will notice that the sound variable was set to ZZZ. And that's it, folks, for this episode. If you want to learn more about operands, operators, and the if statement, and other stuff, if you want to continue, then check out the next video. Otherwise, you can save your project somewhere you like and continue later on. Thank you for watching. Be sure to support the channel by giving it a thumbs up and subscribing if you enjoyed the learning experience. If you have any questions or inquiries, feel free to ask in the comments section.